This man sold the Eiffel Tower. Not a replica. Not a painting. Not a souvenir from a tourist stall on the Rue de Rivoli. The actual Eiffel Tower. And before you decide that could never happen to you, I need you to stay with me for just a moment. Because the men he sold it to weren't fools. They weren't naive. They weren't the kind of people who fall for things. They were exactly the kind of people who don't. That's where this story actually starts. Picture this. You're in the most important room you've ever entered. Not important because of the size, it's actually quite modest. A private dining room, second floor, curtains drawn. But the ceiling is high enough to carry weight. The chandelier doesn't show off, it simply exists at a level you haven't quite reached yet. White tablecloth. Official folders on the table. The smell of serious money-making room for serious business. You've been invited here by the French government. Not contacted. Not approached. Invited. The letter arrived 3 days ago on stationery, so official it didn't occur to you to question it. You've read it 4 times. You know exactly what it says. A sensitive matter of national infrastructure. Discretion required. Confidentiality expected. You told no one. Because men like you, men who have spent 20 years learning how deals are actually made, don't get letters like this often. And when they arrive, you don't waste them. 5 other men are at the table. Suits. Briefcases. Careful eyes. You don't speak beyond pleasantries, because you all know what the other is thinking. Why me? Why us? What's happening? Then the door opens. And a man walks in. He doesn't announce himself with noise or energy. He fills the room the way authority fills a room, quietly, ahead of him, before he opens his mouth. His suit is correct. His posture belongs here. He sets a leather portfolio on the table and looks at each of you exactly long enough. He says the French government has made a decision. The Eiffel Tower is being demolished. And one of you is going to buy it. Here's the thing most people get wrong about this story. They hear it and they think, foolish men. Greedy men. They file it away as something that happens to other people, people who don't know better, who wanted something for nothing, who probably suspected something was wrong and ignored the feeling because the reward was too large. That version of the story is comfortable. It is also completely false. The men in that room were experienced businessmen. Sharp. They understood numbers and risk and the particular smell of a deal that doesn't add up. These were scrap metal dealers, professionals who had built entire careers on knowing exactly what iron was worth and exactly what promises weren't. And every single one of them considered it. That is where the real story begins. Not with the con. With the question underneath it, the one that has been sitting unanswered for 100 years. Why did it work? To understand why it worked, you have to go back before Paris. Before the Eiffel Tower. Before 1925. You have to go to a small town in Austria-Hungary, a place called Hostin, in what is now the Czech Republic, where, on January 4, 1890, a boy was born who would eventually become the most successful confidence artist of the 20th century. His name was Victor Lustig. And the first thing you need to understand about him is this. He was not, primarily, a liar. He was a reader. There is a difference, and it matters. Lying is blunt. You construct a false version of reality, push it toward people, and hope they accept it. Most liars get caught because the false version doesn't quite fit the real one. There are gaps. Friction points. Moments where the story requires the person to leap and they don't. Reading is something else entirely. What Lustig could do, and what historians and criminologists who documented his career consistently describe, most notably in J. Robert Nast's Bloodletters and Bad Men, was walk into a room and, within minutes, understand the precise texture of what the people there needed. Not what they wanted on the surface. What was running underneath. The specific shape of an ambition. The place where a person felt seen and, more importantly, where they felt passed over. He spoke 5 languages fluently. German. French. English. Italian. Czech. Not because he was academically gifted, though he may have been. But because language is how you disappear into someone else's world. By his early 20s, he was working the transatlantic ocean liners. Those great floating palaces that carried the wealthy back and forth across the Atlantic in the years before commercial aviation changed everything. First-class cabins. Card games. Passengers with money and time and the specific restlessness that comes from having almost everything and needing, badly, for something to happen. He didn't run crude schemes on those ships. He performed. He manufactured, with extraordinary precision, the experience of being in the presence of someone worth knowing. Someone worth trusting. He never claimed it. He simply made the room different when he was in it, and people concluded the difference was real. Now here's where it gets interesting. By the early 1920s, Victor Lustig had used at least 47 documented aliases across 3 continents. 47. Think about what that actually means. Not just different names, 47 separate identities. Each with its own history, mannerisms, social context, forged documentation. 47 fully operational versions of a human being. This is not the work of a man with a casual interest in deception. This is the work of someone who has understood, at some fundamental level, that what we are is almost entirely what we perform, and who has decided, accordingly, to perform everything. And then, in 1925, he read a newspaper article. What he did with it changed everything. Most people think of the Eiffel Tower as the symbol it is today, permanent, beloved, the icon of Paris and one of the most recognizable structures on Earth. In 1925, it was none of those things. In 1925, the Eiffel Tower was a problem. Gustave Eiffel had designed it as a temporary centerpiece for the 1889 World's Fair, the universal exposition celebrating the centennial of the French Revolution. It was meant to stand for 20 years. Then be dismantled. The iron would be reproposed. The site cleared. That was the plan. The plan failed. The tower survived its demolition deadline because its antenna had proven militarily useful during the First World War. Practical value bought it more time. But practical doesn't mean free. The tower's 7,300 tons of wrought iron required constant, expensive maintenance. The paint alone, 50 tons of it, applied by workers hanging from scaffolding in the Paris wind, had to be completely reapplied every 7 years to prevent the structure from rusting through. The elevators. The ironwork inspections. The engineering assessments. By the early 1920s, major French newspapers were running editorials questioning whether this aging iron monument was worth what it cost the Republic to keep standing. Lustig read those articles. And something in his mind shifted into a geometry that most people couldn't see. Because he wasn't reading about a cultural icon. He was reading about a political liability. A public debate about the cost of maintaining something that a significant portion of the population didn't particularly want. An iron structure, 7,300 tons of it, sitting in the most visible location in France, generating newspaper arguments about whether it was worth the expense. In the booming scrap metal industry of post-war Europe, where industrial reconstruction had driven raw iron demand to record levels, a tower that size represented extraordinary value to the right buyer. All Lustig needed was to become the government. Not for long. Just long enough. But here's what he did next that most retellings get wrong. Most people, hearing this story, imagine some kind of elaborate theatrical production. A grand scheme. Excitement. Persuasion. What Lustig actually created was the opposite. He created a bureaucratic process. He acquired official-looking government stationery, bearing the seal of the French Republic, through the document manufacturing methods he'd been refining for years. He composed formal letters. Not to excite. Not to dazzle. Dry, procedural, carefully worded invitations to a confidential meeting regarding a sensitive matter of national infrastructure. He sent them to 5 scrap metal dealers in Paris. Think about what those letters felt like to receive. Not breathtaking. Not exciting. Exactly, precisely boring in the way that genuine official government communication is boring. The kind of boring that says, this is real, because nothing fake would be this tedious to read. That was the first layer of the trap. And then he chose the Hotel de Crillon. This is not a minor detail. The Hotel de Crillon sits on the Place de la Concorde, one of the most historically loaded squares in Paris, steps from the Champs-Élysées, in a building where Napoleon Bonaparte once kept his headquarters. President Woodrow Wilson used it as his Paris base during the 1919 peace conference negotiations. By 1925, it was the kind of address that communicated, without a single word, that you were in the center of the world that actually mattered. Not a back office. Not a cafe. The Hotel de Crillon. When those 5 scrap metal dealers walked into that private dining room and saw the white tablecloth and the official folders and the serious lighting, something had already happened to them before Lustig said a single word. The hotel had shifted their internal narrative. They were already inside a story in which this was real. And then he walked in. Calm. Unhurried. Not impressive in the showy way, impressive in the way authority is impressive when it doesn't need to announce itself. He set a leather portfolio on the table. He looked at each man exactly long enough. He introduced himself as the Deputy Director General of the Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs. The title was invented. But it was also completely plausible. The ministry was real. The Eiffel Tower fell under government administration. A Deputy Director General would logically have oversight of infrastructure assets. The fabrication slotted into the dealer's existing knowledge of French bureaucracy without a single point of friction. He thanked them for their discretion. He said the government had made a difficult decision. The tower was too expensive to maintain. It would be dismantled. The iron sold for scrap. The bidding process, for obvious reasons, given the public sentiment attached to the monument, would be handled in complete secrecy. No press. No leaks. No public statements. Did they understand? They said they did. And with that single acknowledgement, Lustig had done something most people completely miss. He hadn't just created a scam. He'd created a lock. Because now, if any of these men doubted what they were hearing, if anything felt slightly off, if they wanted to check, they couldn't. They'd agreed to confidentiality. Any attempt to verify the deal with a journalist or a colleague would be a breach of the government agreement they'd just made. The trap was built from the inside. The next day, he took them to the Eiffel Tower. A site inspection. Standard due diligence. He hired a car. He walked them through the lower structure, pointing at maintenance issues with the measured vocabulary of someone who'd been briefed by engineers. To any observer, a government official doing his job. But Lustig wasn't conducting an inspection. He was conducting an interview. He watched the 5 men the way a card player watches a table, not looking at what was visible, but at what the visible things revealed underneath. Who was calculating fastest? Who lingered? Who asked the questions that came from wanting this to be true rather than wanting to understand whether it was? And one man stood out. André Poisson. A scrap metal dealer. Successful, but not as successful as he needed to feel. Not yet established at the level he believed he deserved. Historical accounts describe a man who was, in the most human possible way, on the edge of something bigger. Close enough to see it. Not yet inside it. He asked better questions than the others. He moved with the energy of a man who had already run the numbers and liked what he found. After the tour, Lustig began calibrating his attention toward Poisson. Barely perceptibly. A slightly longer eye contact here. A more detailed answer there. Nothing that could be named or pointed to. Just enough to communicate, to a man standing outside the door of a world he wanted to enter. You are the one I see. Now, stop and feel that for a moment. Lustig wasn't pulling on greed. He was pulling on something deeper. On identity. On the hunger to be recognized as someone who belongs. An identity, unlike greed, doesn't have a ceiling. Greed can be satisfied with a number. Identity wants to be confirmed. Perpetually. Endlessly. Poisson submitted the highest bid. And then something unexpected happened. He began to have doubts. This is the part of the story that most people don't know. Because this is the moment where most confidence schemes collapse. The buyer sleeps on it. Wakes at 3 in the morning with a cold feeling they can't name. Mentions something vague to a spouse and watches their face change. Goes back to the deal with different eyes. Poisson went back to Lustig. He was careful about it. Professional. He said he had some concerns. Some questions about the process. Things he needed to understand better before proceeding. He was, in plain language, asking one question underneath all the others. Is this real? What Lustig did next is the true masterwork of the entire scheme. He sighed. He looked slightly uncomfortable. Glanced around the room as if checking whether anyone could hear. And then he admitted that there was a dimension to the arrangement he hadn't fully disclosed. That insensitive government contracts handled outside normal procurement channels, and he said this with the specific discomfort of a man confessing something unflattering about his own institution. It was customary for certain officials to receive a personal consideration. A private payment. Separate from the official transaction. He was asking for a bribe. Take a moment to feel the architecture of that. Poisson arrived with a suspicion. Something about this might be wrong. And Lustig responded by confirming it, just not the wrongness Poisson feared. Instead of defending the deal's legitimacy, Lustig compromised it. In a very specific, recognizable, and paradoxically reassuring direction. Because bribery, to a French businessman in 1925, was not an abstraction. It was a known feature of how contracts sometimes worked. A corrupt official asking for a private consideration didn't signal that the contract was fraudulent. It signaled that the official was human. Corruptible. Which meant real. Poisson didn't need the deal to be clean. He needed the deal to be real. And nothing says real quite like corruption. He paid the bid amount. He paid the bribe. He signed the documents. He shook the hand of a man who had never held that title, never worked for that ministry, and was, at that moment, performing one final calculation about how long before he needed to leave the country. Victor Lustig collected everything and left for Vienna. Before we continue, if this documentary resonates with you, subscribe, like and share to help others find this video. Let's continue. Days passed. Poisson waited for a confirmation letter. A follow-up call. The paperwork to clear. Someone to reach out and say, here are the next steps. The phone didn't ring. He went to the Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs in person. Spoke to a clerk. Then another. Asked about the Deputy Director General. Described the meeting. Described the man. No one had ever heard of him. And in the slow, awful arithmetic of that realization, cross-referencing what he remembered against what he was hearing, watching the clerk's face for recognition that never came, Poisson arrived at the only conclusion the evidence supported. He had bought the Eiffel Tower. For scrap. From a man who didn't own it, didn't represent anyone who owned it, and was currently in Vienna. What happened next reveals something important, not just about this con, but about how confidence schemes actually complete themselves. André Poisson did not go to the police. He adjusted his books. He absorbed the loss somewhere it wouldn't surface easily. He told no one. He chose, with full awareness, private humiliation over public exposure. Because the alternative meant sitting in a magistrate's office in Paris and explaining, out loud, that he had handed over tens of thousands of francs to purchase the right to demolish the Eiffel Tower. A monument he had never verified with a single real official. At a meeting he attended on the strength of a letter he never checked. Conducted by a man whose title he never confirmed. He had done none of those things. And he knew it. Lustig had calculated this. Almost certainly. Because the most reliable lock on any confidence scheme isn't the forgery or the location or even the bribe. It's the victim's own psychology in the aftermath. The social cost of disclosure. The arithmetic of shame. The knowledge that reporting the crime requires narrating your own failure in front of people whose opinion of you cannot afford to lose. Without a report, there was no crime on record. Which meant Lustig was free. Free to do it again. He came back to Paris. There are moments in this story where the appropriate response is stunned silence. This is one of them. He sold the Eiffel Tower. Escaped to Vienna. Sat with the money for some weeks. And then returned to the city he had just defrauded and set up the exact same operation for an entirely new group of scrap metal dealers. Same stationery. Same hotel, in some accounts, the Hotel de Crillon itself. Same fabricated title. Different men. Now, why would he do that? Most criminals, after executing something of this scale, take the money and move. Change cities. Put distance between the event and the next chapter. Basic operational sense. Lustig went back to the scene. Within weeks. Here's the explanation that criminologists return to repeatedly in their analyses of his career. At a certain level of mastery, a confidence artist stops experiencing the scheme as a risk and starts experiencing it as a natural state. The role of Deputy Director General had felt more real than his own identity for long enough that returning to it wasn't audacity. It was comfort. He had felt the room respond to him. Had watched experienced, careful businessmen accept his authority without question. Had seen doubt arrive and dissolve under exactly the pressure he'd applied. The mechanics had worked so completely that perhaps failure had stopped computing as a real possibility. This happens to the very best deceivers. Reality starts to feel like the interruption. The construction feels like the truth. The second attempt unraveled. Not with sirens. Not with a dramatic chase. Just one man in the group who grew uneasy in a way he couldn't name, something that didn't quite sit right, a response that arrived a half-second too smoothly, and who, unlike Poisson, chose to act on the unease rather than override it. He made a quiet inquiry. Contacted someone at the actual ministry. The ground shifted. Lustig felt it before it moved. This is a recurring feature of his documented career, an almost instinctive sensitivity to the moment when the environment changes, the moment when the constructed world starts coming apart at a seam. He left. Fast. No calculation. No waiting to see if there was time. He packed what he needed and disappeared back into the network of forged papers and prepared identities that had served as his infrastructure for 20 years. French authorities investigated. They had a description. Hotel records. The accounts of multiple witnesses. They didn't find him. Victor Lustig was already somewhere else, becoming someone else. The Eiffel Tower affair was one entry in a very long ledger. Before Paris, there had been years of ocean liner schemes, card games, fabricated investments, and a device he called the Romanian money box. A beautiful mahogany and brass contraption he claimed could replicate any currency note. He'd demonstrate it with real bills. Charge fortunes. By the time the buyer discovered the box contained only a hidden supply of real currency and would never generate anything on its own, Lustig was carrying a different name in a different country. By his peak years, he had operated on 3 continents under at least 4 to 7 documented aliases. But what made Lustig different, what separates him from ordinary fraudsters in the historical record, wasn't the number of schemes. It was the philosophy underneath them. Among the materials compiled from his case files, researchers documented what they came to call his operating code. A personal set of principles for how he conducted himself. Some call it the 10 Commandments for con men. A few examples. Be a patient listener. Never look bored. Wait for the other person to reveal their political opinions. Then agree with them. Never boast. Let your importance be quietly obvious. Read those and feel what they actually describe. These are not instructions for deceiving people. They are instructions for disappearing into what a person already expects to see. Every principle removes friction. Every principle makes the other person more certain, more themselves, while Lustig becomes a perfect, frictionless reflection. He wasn't playing a character. He was playing a mirror. And the most insidious thing about a mirror is that what you see in it feels true. Because it is you, your expectations, your assumptions, your existing understanding of how authority looks and how serious deals work and how a man with real power carries himself. Lustig didn't impose the fraud from outside. He cultivated it from inside the victim's own perception. After Europe, Lustig moved to the United States. He ran real estate frauds. Investment schemes. Variations of the box. He operated for years, always moving, always calibrating, always one step ahead of the institutional machinery, slowly, methodically trying to close the distance. And then, in the early 1930s, he went further. He connected with a printer and, according to FBI records from that period, helped organize what federal investigators described as one of the most sophisticated counterfeiting operations in American history at that time. High-quality bills. They circulated. They moved through the American economy with the smooth ease of the real thing. But this was different from confidence fraud. Counterfeiting draws the United States Secret Service, an institution whose entire mandate is the integrity of the currency, and which pursues threats to that integrity with a patience that operates on its own timeline entirely. They tracked him for years. And for years, 4 to 7 aliases held. But invisibility has a cost. It requires constant maintenance. The continuous management of who you are and who you were and who you need to be next. And that maintenance, sustained over decades, produces something even the most disciplined mind cannot entirely prevent. Friction points. Small ones. A familiar gesture. A recurring habit. The body keeping its own record even as the names change. On September 10, 1935, federal agents arrested Victor Lustig in New York City. He escaped. He was recaptured the following month. 51 counts of counterfeiting. 20 years in federal prison. He was sent to Alcatraz. Prisoner number 300. Alcatraz in 1936 is not the cinematic ruin of photographs. It is operational. Austere. Functional in the way of places that exist only to contain. The island gave Lustig nothing to work with. No manufactured authority. No carefully selected environment. No marks to read. Just water on all sides, geography designed to make movement impossible, and men on every level sent there precisely because ordinary containment couldn't hold them. For a man whose entire existence was built on fluid identity, on becoming whoever a situation required, the island offered something almost philosophically hostile. One identity. One name. One number. 300A. He served 11 years in federal custody. On March 11, 1947, Victor Lustig died in Springfield, Missouri, at the Federal Medical Center. He was 57 years old. Cause of death, pneumonia. He was buried quietly. On his death certificate, under the line marked occupation, a clerk wrote, "Apprentice salesman." Whether that was an oversight or the darkest joke in American penal history is a question that has never been answered. The Eiffel Tower is still standing. Pause on that for a moment. The tower Lustig sold twice, to men who believed they were purchasing the legal right to tear it apart, survived 2 world wars, the German occupation of Paris in 1940, the liberation in 1944, the reconstruction of an entire continent, and the full sweep of the 20th century into the 21st. It welcomes approximately 7 million visitors a year. One of the most visited paid monuments on Earth. The 50 tons of paint that 1920s editorials called a ruinous expense have been reapplied, on schedule, every 7 years since. The men who paid to demolish it have been dead for decades. There is something structurally ironic in this, and I don't mean it lightly. Lustig's scheme worked precisely because the tower seemed vulnerable. He weaponized the public anxiety about its survival. He took the real fear that the tower might be dismantled and turned it into a private transaction. The fear was real. The transaction was not. And the tower, indifferent to all of it, is still there. But here's the question the tower's survival shouldn't let us avoid. Why did it work? The common assumption is that fraud victims are foolish. Greedy. That somewhere in the transaction they wanted something for nothing and chose to believe what they knew, on some level, wasn't true. That's the comfortable version. It makes fraud the province of the stupid and grasping, and implies that careful, experienced people are safe. The research doesn't support this. What behavioral studies on confidence fraud consistently show is that vulnerability is not primarily a function of greed or naivety. It is a function of the cognitive architecture that makes all of us functional. We use heuristics. Mental shortcuts. We trust signals of authority because, across virtually all of human history, those signals tracked actual authority. We trust people who are calm and certain because calm certainty usually indicates genuine competence. We trust formal documentation because formal documentation usually indicates formal process. These aren't design flaws. They are the features that allow human beings to navigate an infinitely complex world without verifying everything from first principles every single moment of every day. Remove them and you don't get a more careful mind. You get one that cannot function at all. What Lustig understood, with the precision of someone who had spent 30 years studying nothing else, was how to construct an environment where every one of those heuristics pointed in the same direction. The hotel said real. The stationery said real. The title said real. The bureaucratic boredom of the meeting said real. Even the bribe said real, because corruption in 1925 Paris was a known feature of institutional life, and a corruptible official is, paradoxically, more believable than a perfectly honest one. Poisson was not a fool. He was a human being whose cognitive machinery was operating exactly as designed, inside a construction built specifically to exploit that machinery. Now here's where it stops being history. In 2014, a woman named Ruja Ignatova stood on a stage in London and told a room of investors she had built the world's next great cryptocurrency. She had a doctorate from Oxford. She spoke 6 languages. She had the calm, authoritative presence of someone used to being believed. She called it OneCoin. It had no functional blockchain. According to U.S. federal prosecutors who indicted Ignatova in absentia in 2019, OneCoin absorbed an estimated $4 billion from investors across 175 countries. She disappeared from Sofia, Bulgaria in October 2017. She has never been found. The investors weren't foolish. They were doctors, engineers, small business owners, retired professionals, people who assessed the signals of legitimacy and concluded, this is real. The stationery was digital. The Hotel de Krillin had become a conference center. The architecture was identical. According to the FBI's 2023 Internet Crime Report, Fraud losses reported in the United States alone exceeded $12.5 billion in a single year. 1 year. Reported cases only. The Bureau notes these represent a fraction of actual totals, because most victims, like André Poisson, choose private humiliation over public exposure. These schemes are not targeting the uninformed. They are targeting CFOs and operations managers and educated professionals in organizations with compliance teams and fraud awareness training. People with decades of experience who understand how deals work and what bad ones smell like. People exactly like the 5 scrap metal dealers who sat in a private dining room at the Hotel de Crillon in 1925, experienced, careful, sharp, and found themselves quietly considering it. One more thing worth sitting with. A con artist is called a con artist because confidence is the product being sold. Not a tower. Not a contract. Not scrap iron. Confidence. The victim's confidence that what they are experiencing is real. And in the story of Victor Lustig, the most revealing character is not Lustig. It is André Poisson. Because Poisson did something that every careful, intelligent person does when something doesn't quite feel right. He went back. He asked questions. He pushed on the arrangement and demanded explanation. He exercised his critical judgment, exactly as he should have. And Lustig answered the doubt. Not eliminated it. Answered it. That is the masterwork. Because answered doubt is more convincing than no doubt at all. When Poisson's suspicions surfaced and received a coherent explanation, his own critical process had confirmed the conclusion. He hadn't just accepted a claim. He'd questioned it, examined it, received an explanation, and decided to proceed. He had done his due diligence. This is what fraud researchers call inoculation, and it's why the most sophisticated modern schemes don't simply assert their legitimacy. They anticipate the doubt. They construct the doubt, and then they answer it, so that the victim's own intelligence becomes the instrument of their deception. Poisson had done everything right. He had doubted. He had questioned. He had returned with concerns. He had proceeded only after satisfying his own judgment. And he had still been robbed. What do you say after that? I did everything right. I just still got it wrong. The cruelty of that, the specific, structural cruelty of a scheme designed so that careful people are its most reliable victims, is what makes his silence so entirely understandable. And so entirely familiar. The Hotel de Crillon stands on the Place de la Concorde. Renovated between 2013 and 2017. Its neoclassical facade unchanged, its position on one of the most historically laid squares in Europe unchanged, the authority it communicates to anyone who stands in front of it entirely, completely unchanged. You can book a room there right now. You can walk through the lobby and feel the particular, legitimate, entirely reasonable human response to beautiful architecture and serious history. The sense that important things happen in important places, that the setting itself is an argument for the reality of whatever occurs inside it. That feeling is unchanged from 1925. It will be unchanged 100 years from now. And it is precisely that feeling, legitimate, functional, necessary, that Victor Lustig spent his career finding, and turning, and walking away from. Here is what his story actually teaches, underneath all the extraordinary specifics. Human confidence is not a weakness. It is the mechanism by which civilization operates. The substrate of every transaction, every institution, every relationship, every exchange of value between strangers who cannot independently verify everything they depend on. We extend trust constantly, to people, to systems, to information we didn't generate ourselves, because a world in which nothing is trusted is not a world in which anyone can function. The same cognitive machinery that made André Poisson vulnerable to Victor Lustig is the machinery that makes human beings capable of love, of cooperation, of culture, of building things that outlast a single lifetime. You cannot remove one without the other. What Lustig exploited is not a flaw in the operating system. It is the operating system. And perhaps that is the most uncomfortable truth this story carries. Not that we should be more suspicious. Suspicion, universally applied, destroys as much as fraud does. Not trust no one, that is not protection. That is isolation wearing the costume of safety. The lesson is subtler. Harder. More genuinely useful. Understand the machinery well enough to notice when someone else's hand is on the lever. Learn to recognize a constructed environment. Learn the difference between authority that exists and authority that is being performed. Understand that the moment your own critical process resolves a doubt too smoothly, the moment a suspicion that arrived as a warning gets answered so satisfyingly that it transforms into a confirmation, that smoothness is itself a signal worth attending to. There's an easier version of this story. The one where greed is the villain. Where the victims got what they deserved for wanting something too large. That version is satisfying because it locates the fault somewhere clean and contained and implies that people like us, careful, experienced, informed, are safe. But Poisson wasn't destroyed by greed. He was destroyed by the hunger to be recognized. To be the man at the right table at the right moment. By a finely engineered signal that said, "This is your moment, and you are exactly the right person for it." Lustig didn't sell a tower. He sold a story. And the story was, "You belong here." That is the oldest sell in human history. It predates con artists and cryptocurrency and forged government stationery by 100,000 years. Because the need to belong, to be seen as someone who matters, to have the room confirm that you are what you believe yourself to be, is not a defect of character. It is the thing that makes us human in the first place. Victor Lustig, criminal, fugitive, prisoner, ghost of a government official who never existed, understood this with a clarity that most honest people never achieve. He spent his life selling the feeling of being real to people who already were. That is the final irony. He was the one who wasn't. For more videos like this, subscribe, like and share to help other lovers of history find this video, and comment on the part of this documentary that got your attention the most.